Welcome to the Sage Family Podcast, where we explore natural homeschooling, gentle parenting, simple living, and family adventure.
I'm Rachel Rainbolt, the Sage Family Mentor, coming to you from an island in the Pacific Northwest, where I live wild and free in connection with my hilarious husband and 3 growing sailors in our fixer-upper on the beach. So join us around the campfire and let's get living the family life of our dreams. This is episode 83, and today I'm here with Casey Ehrlich talking about pathological demand avoidance or persistent drive for autonomy. Casey is a coach to parents raising PDA autistic children and is the co-founder of the PDA Parents community and podcast. Her background is in social science and methodology, and she holds a doctorate degree from University of Wisconsin-Madison. Casey has conducted original research on conflict, peace, and nonviolence in areas impacted by civil war in Colombia, and she brings those insights to her work with families raising children with hypersensitive nervous systems, fight, flight, and freeze behaviors, and trauma. Her coaching practice is At Peace Parents. On this parenting journey, especially raising a neurodivergent child with a higher level of need or intensity, it is essential to be in connection with other parents who see you, who get it, who can be there for you to cheer on your successful moment of implementing personal growth or troubleshoot your hard moment so you have a better idea for next time. The Sage Family Village is that space for me, and it can be that space for you too. Join us at sagefamily.com/village. I have been following Casey on Instagram for a long time, and she's really doing some solid work in a new area that's resonating with a lot of families. I'm very excited to bring this topic to my community and to share this conversation with you in particular, Casey. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Will you introduce yourself and share a bit about who you are and what you're passionate about?
Sure. My name is Casey, obviously. In my past life, was an academic focused on social science and methodology, and my doctoral work was on grassroots peace building in rural Colombia, South America. So although it seems totally different than what I'm doing now, I do bring in a little bit of that to my parent coaching and education. Now I work exclusively with families whose children they consider to be the PDA neurotype, or pathologically demand avoidant, or we could say pervasive drive for autonomy. And so I started a podcast with another mom friend about over 2 years ago now, PDA Parents. And I started a business about 1.5 years ago, helping parents more formally. What am I passionate about? Nonviolence, non-reactivity, yoga, meditation, and Buddhism.
Love it.
And my kids, obviously. I like to read novels. I don't know what else to say.
That's okay. That's my bedtime routine. I read nonfiction in the morning and then juicy novels at nighttime. Yeah. I love it. Okay. So what is pathological demand avoidance, or like you said, the neurodiversity affirming term that a lot of adults who identify with the experience prefer, persistent drive for autonomy? Those the same acronym, which I love, PDA.
Yeah.
So what's happening inside these kids? What does it look like on the outside?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the formal definition of pathological demand avoidance is an anxiety-driven need for control. But the way that I define it is a little bit different. I define it as a nervous system disability with 5 characteristics. And the basic definition is a survival drive for autonomy that consistently overrides other survival instincts. And I think that really helps to differentiate it between like other neurodivergent children who also have a very high need for autonomy, and also, you know, even in the neurotypical space, children do well with more autonomy. So That's sort of like the threshold, like when it begins to, in the moment or in accumulation, disable a child from accessing either toileting, eating, sleeping, bathing, and teeth brushing, and or safety.
Nice. Okay. So it's like a nervous system disability in the way that you conceptualize it. And one thing I hear you talk a lot about are equalizing behaviors. And I think that can be helpful in helping people understand kind of what it looks like how to know
Sure.
if your kid is struggling with it, how, like what it would be like from the outside. Can you talk a little bit about those equalizing behaviors?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to answer your first question more explicitly, which was like, what's actually going on inside the child? So to ground this, often I ask parents to imagine a time when their fight or flight response went off, like whether or not they were, whether or not they have a history of anxiety and have panic attacks or have been in a car crash. It's like what the body does when it perceives on a subconscious and like automatic in the moment level. So it's like what your body would do if you had a gun to your head. So you would have your heart racing, your pupils dilate, potentially have diarrhea or throw up, which you see a lot with these kids because your metabolism is ramping up, cortisol's going, adrenaline's going, and your body's like taking over. So the same thing happens with these kids every time on a subconscious or conscious level. Their brain perceives a loss of autonomy, freedom and choice, or equality to those around them, both like teachers, parents, siblings, other kids, or even like societal expectations, like we wear clothes. And so, one of the things I encourage parents to look for is like in the moment fight, flight, freeze indicators. And those can be different for each child. And you really have to tune in because some kids have more of a freeze response. Some are more fight or what looks like defiance, opposition, aggression, which is more like where my child, how he has expressed historically. And then other indicators like over time that we look at are in terms of how it impacts basic needs, like, on each dimension, I could talk about like what toileting could look like, what eating could look like, but I don't want to go too deep if that's not the question.
Well, I know that PDA is considered to fall under autism. Is that right?
Yeah.
But I also know that this label and the work being developed around it is resonating with a lot of people who may not have considered their child to be autistic before this. So can you speak to that piece a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So a question I get a lot is, are all PDA kids autistic? And my perspective is, in accordance, it's the same as the PDA Society and many autistic adult advocates who are also great resources, which is that it is part of the autism spectrum. And the reason I believe this is because of the amount of families I've worked with who didn't think their child was autistic until the threat response came down and they could more clearly see the social communication differences and how restrictive or repetitive interests, as we call it in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual 5, how they can manifest in a social way. So these kids often become more fixated on other children or a particular person. And so it's social in nature. And then, they do have a different way of sensing and perceiving the world. They often have sensory issues, and a parent can often improve communication and connection drastically by working on social communication and speaking their language more than neurotypical patterns of thought of speaking. So, but I, as a researcher, I don't know if it's always the case.
Yeah. No, it's such a, I mean, really, technically we're still on the first question here, but it's because this is really it all feels relatively new and it's resonating so much with so many people. And I really kind of want to stretch out and explore and kind of feel out where the edges are of this. Cause I find it's really interesting and really helpful. Like, what's the difference between PDA and oppositional defiant disorder? Like, because a lot of kids will sort of start with that diagnosis, right? And then maybe come over.
Yeah. Okay. So I forgot to tell you about equalizing, but it's going to tie into this question.
Okay.
Okay. So I stand firmly with Mona Delahook, who is brilliantly brilliant and a clinician. And she doesn't really believe in oppositional defiant disorder. And I don't really either, because I think there's always a deeper cause or a root cause, whether it is trauma or neurodivergence, right? Because when we look deeper, it's often like we're just seeing these surface level behaviors, but the root cause isn't just like they're defiant.
Or parenting and family dynamics.
Yeah. But I mean, the most basic thing I say to parents is like, are the strategies suggested for oppositional defiant disorder, like from your perspective, making it worse or better? And if they're making it worse, let's explore something different, right? Yes. But I think whether or not it's PDA, we can look at it through the nervous system lens and understand that if it's fight flight, it's not a conscious decision, it's not a motivated behavior. And also, as I said before, PDA kids are autistic. So if it's oppositional defiant disorder and not impacting basic needs, like they don't have any trouble eating, sleeping, hygiene, toileting, and they also are neurotypical in every other way. They don't have sensory issues. They don't have differences in social communication. Then maybe it's not PDA, but I wouldn't define it as ODD just because I think it's a bunk diagnosis. But I'm not a psychologist, so I'm allowed to say that, right? I'm not going to get
my take on it is that like I would never disallow the use of a label that feels helpful for someone. And in all of my decades working with thousands of children, I've never met a child who I would ever diagnose with that. Like it was always more like you said, like, let's look at what's lying underneath this and address those things, and then it would resolve. So yeah,
it's like an empirical question, right? It's like if the data right in front of you is showing that like by accommodating the nervous system, the behavior is reduced, then maybe the root cause wasn't like you need to train them to act differently. Equalizing behavior is also the other side of it, where anytime the brain perceives a loss of balance, equality, autonomy, in order to get back to a place of safety, a child will engage in equalizing behaviors. This is what Christy Forbes calls leveling or compensation behavior. And what this looks like, it can be in the moment, but it can look like very controlling behavior where the child is like controlling your line of vision while you're watching a movie with them, where they're saying you can't go to the bathroom, where they're correcting your words. Like it's not exactly oppositional. It can look more like OCD. And so it's like this complex tapestry of behaviors that's not just oppositional or just avoidance. And so that's another reason I wouldn't put it in oppositional defiant disorder. Kids often say like, my legs don't work, or I want to, but my body won't let me, or stop talking, right? Like it's not like this defiance of trying to like show they're more in power. It's like their body's actually being disabled by their nervous system.
Yeah. And I think regardless of the like language or the labels and what you find helpful, kind of looking at the situation through that lens of like nervous system disability can really help people kind of cut through a lot of the parts that don't super matter on the ground and like actually get at the heart of like adjusting the connection and the lifestyle and that kind of stuff to make things a little bit easier and a little bit better.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, will you walk us through your personal journey with raising a PDA child?
Sure. So I dove into some of your stuff and I was like, oh man, she's such a gentle mama. And like, she's basically the polar opposite of who I was before I started this journey. So I was not a gentle mama. I was not someone who wanted to stay home or be a homemaker. It's still not my like strong suit in terms of how cute your tapestry is in the background. Like, I'm just not good at that stuff.
Okay, well, for the record, I did not make that. I bought it from Etsy. So.
All right, fine. But like, that makes me feel a little bit better. But I like have always just felt much more comfortable in the cerebral realm, right? Which is why I went into academia, and I'm a dork. So I never wanted to stay home. I was very rule oriented myself. I was a compliant child. I loved school. If my neurotype was anything, it'd probably be more of the like rigid autistic, let's make us Excel spreadsheets. And I don't say that disparagingly. That's like actually more how I am.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, cause and effect. Like, my son has to do what I want, right? I'm an authority. And as things started to get more difficult with him, I doubled down on all the traditional parenting stuff. So like 1, 2, 3 magic, which was an absolute horrendous experience. But I like doubled down. I was like, no, let's watch the DVDs again. And let's like do what this guy says, because he has a PhD. And
I'm going to follow the evidence-based practices and I'm going to do it right. And
yes. It was reinforced by pediatricians who are like, you need to be stricter. You need to follow through. And because his expression, my son's expression, was much more explosive, it looked like bad behavior. And so, but things kept escalating and escalating. And I remember, so I used to work at the Pew Charitable Trusts in Washington, D.C. And I remember being in like a really nice suit in a stairwell with one of my colleagues and just like weeping and being like, I have to leave this job because I'm 2 different versions of myself. And like, I can't keep showing up and like leading a team of researchers and methodologists, like as if I've got it all together, and then getting on the metro and just dreading walking into my home because I'm like afraid of my own son. And I had a newborn, and William, who I'll call him, and I would have to like many times pick him up and run into the street while my husband would like stay behind to try and keep my son safe in his fight expression. And I remember also weeping in the street with like my baby and a Bjorn, and like the neighbors being like, okay. And I was like, no, I'm not at all. So Father's Day, when was it? 2019? I just was like sitting in a yoga class, again, weeping, and I'm not a crier. So like, I was like, okay, I'm quitting my job and I'm going headlong into this. And I took my son to Chicago because I had a dear friend from college who was an autism specialist and does like a play-oriented approach. She used to do ABA, but she had all her connections in the SLP, speech language pathology world, and occupational therapy, and they assessed him. And basically during that long weekend, she introduced me to a different way of parenting. Like I didn't even know there was like something other than rewards and consequences and timeouts and sticker charts. Like, so she didn't introduce me to PDA, but she introduced me to like another possibility. So I came home and I like announced to my husband in the kitchen, we're going to be gentle parents and we're going to like do time ins and co-regulate. And he's like, what's co-regulate? And I'm like, I don't know, but I'm going to figure it out. And I remember him, also very cerebral man, being like, what's the theory of change? Like he wanted proof that it was going to fix it. And I was like, I don't have one. But basically for the past 3 years, that's what I've been doing, is developing a theory of change so I can explain it and provide stepping stones to families so they can articulate what's going on and how to move forward. And then we moved to Michigan because we couldn't afford to live in DC without 2 careers, and spent 2 years full-time caregiving and learned about PDA, which was also a process that I walk parents through, because it's not just like pick up a book and then you get it, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of radical acceptance of how your life needs to change, and that's the hard part.
Yeah.
Yeah, and here we are. Now I have a business and I'm a parent coach, so it's like 180.
And I think that for what it's worth, even on this very podcast, an immense amount of the people I share conversations with have a similar arc, in that most of us were not raised this way, and we did not start off this way. And for many of us, myself included, I came into parenting saying oh, all the evidence-based practices. I've read every book. I have all the degrees in this, and I'm going to do it so right. And I'm going to be the best at doing it exactly right. And then I met my firstborn child, and that child showed me a whole new way, that was necessary to meet this kid's needs. Right. And so just, that helps you to feel a little less alone. I think many of us had kind of a similar arc, a journey in getting to the place where we were actually living in relative peaceful connection, at least it feeling really good in how we were showing up, and helping our kids to be their best selves in whatever way that means for each kid.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Okay, so what style of parenting best supports a PDA child and their family's functioning and well-being? I know you said you kind of started off in that mainstream cause, effect, rewards, punishments, all that stuff, and kind of made your way over to gentle parenting's co-regulating and, meeting of needs and all that. But speak to that a bit, what style of parenting really helps the family function the best?
Yeah, I mean, so the way I think about it isn't a philosophical way. It's a more this is how the neurobiology of the brain and nervous system works. And here are the accommodations we can use to prevent or de-escalate the threat response, so we can get our children back into the thinking brain as much as possible so they can learn from your modeling. And I think it is a little bit different than gentle parenting, because we really have, as parents of PDA children, we really have to track our child's regulation levels and nervous system activation like a mom of a diabetic child would track insulin levels. And the decisions we make in any given moment are going to reflect that more than a set of limits and boundaries that are static. And that can be really difficult to incorporate even to a gentle parenting framework, because you're operating within constraints that parents of children who aren't PDA are not. The cost benefit framework is different, because the cost of setting a limit or a boundary or saying no is so much higher for the actual physical well-being of the child. It can stop them from eating, right? If you put too many limits. So it's a different cost benefit calculation. So that I coach families through a way of thinking, and then situate their child's cost benefit and understanding their child's threshold, which often we have to go way below to even see it, which means when my son was in burnout, I co-regulated him 100% of the time, not just physically present. It was I could not speak to my husband. I can't do laundry. I can't do dishes. There is this direct trade-off, right? And he would run by me and slap me on the butt. And now I would put a boundary around that, because he and I are in a much different place. But then the cost of being don't hit me on the butt would have been he wouldn't eat that night. And so that cost benefit does not exist in the same way when we're just talking about lowering demands or being more gentle with children, because from my understanding, you still have to have some limits. I mean, I do have limits in my family. They're just so few that I think it would seem radical even to a gentle parent. But perhaps I'm wrong, because honestly, I've never delved too deep into that. But I do have a lot of parents from the gentle parenting space who are like, I need to go deeper because this isn't sufficient.
Yes. Yeah. I think like a lot of my audience is kind of this overlap of gentle parenting and unschooling. And in unschooling, especially, like we're pretty, like that muscle of letting go of limits is pretty strong. And basically what I advocate for is like, we have like 3 agreements that like, it's essentially do no harm. Like I will only intervene with a boundary if like you're hurting yourself, someone else, or the environment. And there's a lot of subjectivity in that and a lot of room for flexibility, very, intentionally. Like at times it can be like me physically just moving my body in a different position to protect other children, but I'm still not putting a boundary on this kid. I would call that like co-regulating, where I'm just sort of, all the things that I know we're going to talk more about. I really like that like cost benefit analysis piece, because I think we don't talk about it enough, quite frankly. I think there are a lot of systemic gaps that put a lot on the primary caretakers, and especially if you have a neurodivergent child, especially if you have a child who has an experience like PDA, that's a really high level of demand on the parent. And often the conversations only center around like, what's best for the child's well-being in this moment. But like, we have a whole family, like you have a baby, you have like, I can't always, I can't always like put the boundary and then keep everyone safe for the next 4 hours while they throw things and thrash and scream and hit. Like, so
and then it affects your nervous system and ability to show up in a non-reactive way.
Yes.
Totally. And then it affects the marriage because you're pissed off that the dad wasn't there. Totally.
Yes. I think this cost benefit analysis thing is something that like a lot of primary caretakers are doing like on the down low and kind of running that calculation and feeling guilty for it.
Yeah.
And like recently, actually in a video game episode, we kind of talked a little bit about like, hey, it's okay to also hold space for like what's best for the family overall and what your bandwidth is in that moment and what's your child's like how much cumulative stress is in their system and what are they capable of in this moment. Like it's okay for us to hold space for all of that piece as well. So I love that you're kind of bringing that in and highlighting that, hey, if you're parenting a PDA kid, that's going to be an even more prominent part of your parenting decision-making.
Yeah, because the decision, parents are often looking to me to give them like a strategy or a protocol to, like the question I get is, how do I set a boundary or a limit so that my child won't have fight, flight, freeze? And my response is, that's the disability itself and you can't. And that's why we have to understand that like there will be a cost to the nervous system. It doesn't mean you shouldn't set the boundary. It just means like then we move into de-escalation as the accommodation. And when we're making that decision, it's like the cost benefit becomes very different because there is this big, sometimes dangerous response from setting a boundary, even a little one, even putting a body between a body, because that's a loss of autonomy perceived, right? So I find making it explicit takes away a lot of the shame and guilt for parents, because all of us are operating within constraints.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so you mentioned accommodations, and I want to lean a little bit more into that and talk to you about what accommodations you've seen as helpful for PDA kids. Sure.
So for me, if you can understand the logic, you can get really creative with what this looks like. So, if any loss of autonomy is setting off the threat response and any loss of equality is setting off the threat response, we can sort of preempt that by baking in opportunities for choice and opportunities for the child to feel above us. And so let's talk about the equality one. And some of the things I'm going to say are controversial because I see on social media how people respond and they're like, that's teaching them the wrong thing. And I'm just putting it out there as like ideas.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Ideas.
Okay. So So in terms of equality, like I'm always thinking like my son perceives himself below anything and he's going to have a stress response, like a lion's in front of him. So how can I preempt that? I'm always putting myself physically below him. I'm allowing him to climb on top of a van or sit on top of a couch or climb on windowsills, because then he's physically above and it's preempting the threat response. If I need to have a conversation with him, I sit physically below him to prevent the threat response. I also incorporate opportunities for like equalizing or him controlling me into play. Right? Like we play things like Sassy Baby or Baby Puppies, and he's just basically directing me around and correcting me. But it's like, and people are like, well, that's not teaching them how to play, but I don't even look at it like that. It's like, he knows how to play. He just needs
like
to
play therapy.
get back to a place of safety. And I'd rather it be like this than him hovering around my now 4-year-old and getting between him and his toys and being like poop, 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 right? Because that's equalizing behavior. So I hope that's like okay to say.
Yes. Yes. Bathroom talk is allowed here.
Okay. So, I also do a lot of preempting that equalizing by self-deprecating humor, or I might make fun of myself, or I might be like, Mama messed up. I can't believe I forgot that. In terms of communication, I always am thinking through the lens of like, he's speaking a different language than I am, even though he's highly verbal and articulate. So I know that direct questions and unsolicited or unconsented to speech is activating. So like, I don't speak to him until he speaks to me. I don't ask direct questions. I use declarative language. So if you're interested in that, that's like the Declarative Language Handbook by Linda K. Murphy. Super helpful for PDA kids.
Can you give me an example of that?
Oh, sure. Okay. So like in the morning, he comes down and I say hi to our service dog and wait for him to say something. And if he doesn't, I don't talk to him. Same as after school, right? And he'll talk to me. It's just, I wait first. And that's really hard for parents. It seems simple, but like, we're always like, how was school? How'd you sleep? What do you want for breakfast? And imagine that every time you said that, his brain is experiencing panic that sends signals to his nervous system, like you're going to die. And it just builds and builds.
Because that's a demand. Like when we're starting a conversation, there's an expectation that they respond, and there are rules for how they're supposed to respond. And
yeah. And it's a loss of autonomy because they didn't consent to the conversation. And you're putting yourself above them, according to the logic of the brain. Again, this is not like a normative thing for me personally. So then I use declarative language, like, let's say we're getting ready for school, and instead of being like, do you want to put your shoes on or where are your shoes? First, I try and do it non-verbally. I bring it over and I sit on the ground and I'm like, sometimes I just start putting his shoes on, or I might say, I can put your shoes on for you. So instead of asking, do you want me to put your shoes on? I just use a declarative sentence. And then he responds to it. And then I take that cue. Or if I'm trying to have a conversation about trying to understand what goes on inside of him internally, which is often really hard to decipher because he talks a lot, but he doesn't talk about his internal emotions or anything. So, let's say I did this when I was trying to understand how to shift schools for him. Like he could not talk about public school or anything about it. And so I would have to come in like the side door using declarative language and say things like, when I was 6, my favorite thing to do at school was swinging on the swings and singing songs to make sure that it snowed with my best friend, Lauren. Period. Pause. And then I had the opportunity to collect the data of like, did even mentioning school activate him? Or is he open enough where I can say another sentence about school? And we really had to like do that dance over the course of weeks, and every day, every night, sitting on the floor and using declarative language, where finally he started talking about wanting to try a different school. And so And then just connection, like understanding that the love language is different, that, I can count on my hand, the number of times he said, I love you. Right. And when I used to say, I love you, he would say, stop saying that. But now I coach parents to understand that, like, gift giving or parallel play, engaging in separate interests in the same room, or squishing into your body, or monologuing or info dumping about a special interest is love language. And so that's just on communication, like sort of how I would help parents understand both how to think about it, but also like some tools they can implement, like sitting on the ground, using declarative language, introducing pauses, reducing the complexity of speech. And I recommend that even for parents whose kids aren't autistic, because when they start doing it, they see how much comes out. And then it's like, oh, maybe there is a social communication difference. Right?
Yeah. Okay, I recently shared a conversation on this podcast with Dr. Ellie Leibowitz about reducing accommodations to alleviate childhood anxiety. And you recommend embracing accommodations. And kind of a key distinction that I've heard you make is between nervous system disability versus anxiety. I know anxiety is sort of in the like textbook definition of PDA. But you kind of shift the framework a bit to nervous system disability. Can you speak to that distinction? How do parents know if it's going to be helpful to like lean into accommodations or to reduce accommodations?
Absolutely. So that's a really good question. I'm so happy to answer it. And I actually learned a lot from one family I coached, who I hope that I served them, because we went through the accommodation lens, and then she decided to take a more exposure-based approach, and it really worked for her family. That's not the case with most of the families I work with, because most of them have already tried the exposure and the more conventional approach to anxiety. And the premise of that is the same with OCD, right? Like, we don't just constantly shy away from what's triggering us, or else we reinforce the anxiety and the rumination, and it becomes bigger in our heads. And I get that because I'm an anxious person, right? Like going live on Instagram, I push through it and feel better about myself. I don't accommodate myself and like not do the things, right?
Yeah.
So this is a great question also, because a lot of these kids have both generalized anxiety, like my son, and this nervous system disability. So what I would say to this is, yes, there are these like two, quote, opposing viewpoints of like accommodating the nervous system and exposure or pushing through. And I don't think that they're actually diametrically opposed. I think we can think of it more chronologically and in root causes, right? So like, is it more ruminative? Is it more cognitive? Is it more anticipatory? And I have seen that with my son too, right? And that would fall more into the anxiety realm. The nervous system response, they cannot feel anxious at all or even think they're anxious. They can be excited, and the excitement registers as an internal loss of autonomy, and they suddenly have a physiological response, right? So it's like this in the moment, my nervous system's doing something that's not necessarily aligned with the way that my brain is thinking, right? And it can get into more of a, this paradox. And so, but I do think it's really important, and what perhaps distinguishes me or separates me somewhat from other voices in this field is that I do think that there is a place for pushing a little bit, but I think parents often dramatically underestimate like where their child's threshold is. So they're pushing and pushing and pushing, and they haven't even located like where that tracking can happen, like with the insulin levels, right? So when the child reaches me, well, the parent, they're usually in full-on burnout. And what do you have to do in burnout? You have to get them out of burnout and back into their thinking brain. So we err on the side of accommodation, so you can even locate what's behind the threat response, what's behind this
I call that drowning. Like when I'm working with families, it's like, okay, the first thing we have to do is drown them in connection, drown them in autonomy, drown, like just everything is a yes. The only boundaries are boundaries that are absolutely like life-threatening if you don't hold them. Like drown them in that. And then once you get that baseline down, then you can start, like you talked about, like actually observing and noticing and learning and getting to know like where all of those triggers are and what it looks like when things start to accumulate and all of that.
Totally. Yeah. And so what I encourage parents to do is track on 3 dimensions, which are sometimes at one stage in the journey when they're in burnout, diametrically opposed. Like you can't focus on like skill acquisition and developmental timelines and compliance and take care of the basic needs, the connection with you, and their fight flight expression of the disability, which is looking like behavior. So we have to focus on those indicators, figure out where the baseline is, and then dance on the edge of that threshold. So that's like where I am now with my son, but we're 3 years into rebuilding after I traumatized him, right? With my parenting and like locking him in a room because that's what the book told me to do. And so, and some kids have that with school or with more behavioral ABA type therapies. So like, this is why it's not a blanket, school is bad, and if you take kids out of school, they'll be fine. It's like, where is the trauma? Like my kid's trauma was with me, not with school. That was his fun place.
Yeah.
So yes, we have to push a little bit on the edge so that they can have some resilience, but always understanding that we're often, I think most of the time, pushing too much.
Yes. I think you brought in a good point too, with like the school was your kid's happy place and you were the source of the trauma in the masking piece. Like that can also make it really hard because the masking can be high. So when your kid is in school, you know, the teachers are like, they're great. I don't know what you're talking about. Like, yeah, it's totally. So easy. Totally. It's so easy. What do you like? This is a you problem.
100%.
Like this is in your head.
Yeah. I mean, I thought it was crazy. That's why we started the podcast, the first one. Cause I was like, when I met another mom, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not crazy.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there is like my son takes anti-anxiety medication, for example, and and now I can locate, like, is he having an activation in the moment because of the transition, and can I support him through it because he really wants to do this thing? Or, am I pushing him past his threshold? And sometimes I make mistakes, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes I think he can do something and then the cost is a lot higher than I thought it would be. And that's part of it, right?
Yeah. And learning on our end too. Like sometimes we might think that we can handle the cost of this thing. And then we, do the thing and realize, I did not. So like, I need to do a little bit of that logging on myself too about like, okay, so if I'm feeling this, or if I've had this experience, if my cumulative stress like is, at this level, then I can't, not co-regulate in that moment, or we can't work on that, removing that accommodation in that moment. So what kinds of support can be helpful for families struggling with PDA?
So there's a great list of PDA affirming practitioners and clinicians that I'm happy to share with your listeners.
Yes, let's link to
it. America. Awesome. PDA North America is a good resource. They just became a nonprofit. I have a list of coaches also. Like I'm a coach, but I have a wait list. So if people reach out about that, I often give them a list of people I know in the space in the US. But I think more broadly, like finding trauma-informed, relationship-based therapists can be helpful. I think parents have to be really careful that their desire to improve things and pushing their child towards like occupational therapy or play therapy doesn't backfire. Yes, they have sensory needs, but actually autonomy is a bigger need. So by pushing them to occupational therapy, you're degrading trust and it's counterproductive. But I've found art therapists, a lot of occupational therapists, a lot of trauma-informed therapists, DIR, floor time certified therapists. They are more conducive to like a PDA friendly approach. I really am hopeful of forming more bridges with the clinical and medical space. I don't think it serves anyone to set up these othered groups of like, we're the parents and we're the autistic advocates and we're the clinicians and we're all like in these separate silos, you know? I mean, people are welcome to come to my workshops and programs to help their kid. I really focus on the parent and the parent journey, and it's about helping the parent implement shifts. So I don't work with kids, but I think there's a lot of people out there who do.
Excellent. Okay. Kind of the last thing I want to talk about are fears, because there are some big fears that create resistance to acceptance of PDA. Can you walk us through some of those to the other side?
Sure. Are we talking about like big picture fears or like day to day, if I let them do this, then X will happen?
Either. Yeah, either. I think I hear a lot of both. For example, when I talk about like having a period of drowning them to kind of reset, I tell parents like to do that until your kid says to stop, or until your kid, like if my kid if a kid wants to be the baby, they have a new sibling and they want to be infantilized, I will like swaddle them and carry them until they say, put me down.
Totally.
Right? Yeah. Like all the things until they say like, no, put me down. And that's when, like they're satiated. And so a fear might be like that they would never be satiated. Like, well, you're not going to have like a 15-year-old boy swaddled in your arms that you haven't put down. Like they will at some point, like say like, no, put me down. I want to run around. Like that would be an example of like one fear in that component. So like, what are some fears that parents have? I know there are some bigger picture ones, like my kid is going to be a murderous, psychopath, abusive monster, and then some smaller everyday ones.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me speak to the biggest fear I think is out there, which actually isn't a parent fear. It's the like PDA isn't real. And I think that comes from a valid fear, which is like the same fear.
I've created this.
No, like not from a parent perspective in the like research field and like the autistic advocacy space, which is like, if we name this one thing as needing accommodations, then it's basically implying that it's its own category, and autistic and neurodivergent kids should keep doing ABA and all these non-gentle approaches. So I want to name that because I think
Got it.
That's a fear I see a lot of in the bigger sense.
Yeah.
The drowning example, like, I just want to put an asterisk on that because a lot of what I work with parents on is mindset shifts and lifestyle changes around parenting a disability. And so like there are elements of the waterfall drowning needing to be there always. And so that's when we talk about like bringing in other caregivers.
Yeah. Right? The acceptance part that like, no matter what you do, they're not going to not have this neurodivergence. Like you can't, there's no strategy that you can do that will make this not be who they are.
Yeah. Like they might need signals of nervous system safety and undivided attention even when they're 15. It might not be swaddling, but like they need you to be giving the undivided attention or someone to feel safe in their body, which is a valid fear. But if we can, I walk parents through the like, what if nothing changed? Like, how would you set up your life to find joy? Which parents don't like to do, but it's like such a powerful shift. And that's like when I went through it, I was like, okay, I need to find other help caregiving. I need to start thinking about my future and my career differently.
I find super helpful with parents and working through that piece is to say, okay, imagine you're in like a white void and there's nothing there. It's just you floating there. And then your kid gets dropped in. You get to design every single element of that white void, except your kid is exactly who they are and nothing will ever change.
Oh, that's beautiful.
So this person is exactly who they are. You have zero control. There's nothing you can change at all. But like you could add a tree. You could what's the weather? Like, what does it smell like in this space? What are you feeling on your skin? Like, do you sit down? What do you sit on? Like, who else is there with you? Like, so we can design all of these other things to like give you the best life that you can live, but we can't change like this human that's untouchable.
Yeah. And so much of what parents are grieving is not the child itself. It's like, but I wanted to travel.
Yeah.
But I wanted to have a big career with my husband too. Right.
Yeah.
And you just have these constraints or, their financial trade-off. So
you have to grieve the child you imagined. You have to grieve the life that you had imagined.
Yeah. Or like a quiet home without screaming.
Yeah.
I mean, for someone who likes libraries, that's been a hard one. But I think the fear that parents come down to, the root fear, is they're scared they're doing it wrong, right? They're scared if I allow this, and they're scared they'll hurt their child. They're scared that their child won't be happy and won't flourish. And I get that. It's like, if I don't teach my child to greet the grandparent when they walk in, they're never going to learn how to greet someone when they walk in the door. And then they're never going to be able to have friends or get a job because they won't know that social norm. And then they'll be alone and I'll be dead and no one will be there to take care of them. I'm serious. That's like 0 to 100.
Yeah.
What parents are thinking about. Or like, if I don't teach them right from wrong. And like, I guess like the only place I get philosophical or spiritual is like, I truly believe, like from a Buddhist perspective, that we all have inner goodness. And that the threat response, whether it's PDA or not, or just someone having a hard day, it's like obscuring from that divine goodness. And so my task and what I help parents with is like reducing the threat response to reveal what's behind it. And often what's behind it is like a child who does know right from wrong, or at least in their thinking brain enough so they can access a skill, right? Usually when I'm counseling parents, we talk about it more from a brain science perspective, but like there is this belief that I hold, which is your child's a good child, no matter what you're seeing on the outside. And like, that's what we're working towards. And so if we let the reins off, if the child is innately good, they're not going to like go become a terrible person. They're going to thrive, I think,
Yeah.
And I've seen it with my own son. I've seen it with other families where if I had just taken his behavior, I mean, I used to think he's going to end up suicidal in an institution or hospitalized because of his behavior. And I couldn't see the good, so I had to trust it.
Yes.
But he has reinforced it over time because I've seen it now, like what's behind the nervous system reaction.
Yes. And since we ultimately can't, they, even as adults, wouldn't be able to make themselves be somebody they're not, we're sort of teaching them how to live as well as they can with who they are. So that includes noticing their cumulative stress and building a life in which they can have the accommodations that they need, to live a life that's meaningful for them.
Yeah.
And a threshold to like be in connection with people who see that goodness within them, people who love them.
Yeah, totally. And they're neurokin,
Yeah. Neurokin. Oh my God, I've never heard that term before. And I am like instantly in love.
I did not invent it. It's from the neurodiversity space.
I have never heard that before. I'm in love with it. I'm going to use it all the time now. Okay. Neurokin. Yeah. All right. The show notes can be found at sagefamily.com/podcast83, where you can also subscribe and get future show notes sent right to your inbox. What are your favorite resources, Casey, for people to dive deeper into this topic? I know you've mentioned like Mona De La Hook. You've mentioned the declarative language piece. And then I want to know about all your stuff too, and where we can find you.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So like, if you're more of a brain science-y clinical
We're
type,
geeky here.
Yeah, I really love polyvagal theory. I think The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk is essential for understanding the mechanisms of the nervous system.
Agreed.
I really like The Explosive Child by Ross Greene. Then I think a very key resource is going to actual like PDA autistic testimonies. So I'll start with Christy Forbes, who is a leader in the field. Sally Cat, who's a more internalized expression of PDA and talks about masking in a nuanced way. Harry Thompson, he wrote the PDA Paradox. I really like the nonprofit Neuroclastic, which is actually autistic writings, and they have a part about PDA. Back to the non-autistic resources. I really like the Tilt Parenting podcast. I'm sure many of your listeners have.
Yes, I've had a conversation with Debbie Reaver here and with Ross Greene. We're from The Explosive Child. So yeah.
Oh, The Whole Brain Child by Dr. Dan Siegel. I think a lot about the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain.
Tell us about you. Tell us where we can be connected with you, where we can get your support.
Yeah, so I'm everywhere now. I've gotten past my own little anxiety through exposure, and I'm on TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. And that's handle is @PeaceParents, and Facebook is @PeaceParents. I also have a podcast, the @PeaceParents podcast. And then if you want more of me, then you can join any of my programs. I have like a signature program, which is a 3-month program with a group of families called the Paradigm Shift Program. We're in our 4th cohort right now, and that's really great. It's like a hybrid between teaching, Q&As, but also like support in a community and Slack. So it's real time. I have an accommodation and progress with PDA workshop, which I run 4 times a year. And that's like how to track progress using indicators. And like, that's where I bring in my social science and methodology training. And then there's a bunch of $25 master classes. Like if you just want to dip your toe and take one step forward, mostly to help you wrap your mind around it and make decisions. Yeah. Our next one I'm doing with an occupational therapist, actually for therapists to help them work through the PDA lens in a therapy space.
Well, that's cool.
So that should be in February.
Nice.
Yeah. And then I do coaching, but I have a wait list, and I don't work with a bunch of families at once because we go so deep.
Yes, you may totally get it. Yeah, same. Oh, thank you so much for sharing this conversation with me. This has been one of those things that's kind of like been on my peripheral for a really long time. And then when I found you on Instagram, you know, it kind of pulled me in even more, and I just keep kind of circling around it. So it's something that, like, from a clinical perspective, like, I learned nothing about this at all whatsoever. And even a lot of the like clinicians that I'm in connection with and family therapists and stuff, it's just sort of considered like fringe. And yet the families, like on the ground, this is a very big thing that's helping a lot of people. So I really wanted to kind of like shine a light on it, put a microphone in it.
Awesome.
Let's amplify it a bit. And if it's helpful, like here are all these resources, that Casey just shared with you. So you can dive a little bit deeper into it. So thank you so much for the work you're doing. Thank you so much for coming here and sharing this conversation with me. You are a gift.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me.